Climate change. Our first presenter this afternoon is Connor Mack. Connor is a graduate of UC Berkeley, and listen to this, everybody. This dude right here, last year at this time, right now he's getting his master's degree from Scripps. He's great at coding, all this stuff. Last year he was accepting Pac-12 Academic All-American Awards. Berkeley baseball, think about that. Pac-12, one of the toughest conferences in the country academically, Stanford, UCLA, USC, Berkeley. And then the level at which baseball is played in this conference, there are guys Connor play with who are currently already in the major leagues. So it's a guy who can write Python scripts and hit a 96 mile an hour fastball. Not so much the 79 mile an hour changeup on the outside corner though, but got a really, really talented, hardworking student who's just like incredibly like chill and calm and easy to have in the group. So I really am so excited that we brought Connor in this year, and I think Connor has opened the door for a lot of people like him who have proven in college that they're hard workers, super smart, and are just ready to take the jump to climate. So Connor, it's been great having you, and floor is yours, brother.
All right, let me pull this up here. Thanks, Corey, for that wonderful introduction. Let's see. All right, cool. So I'm super excited to be kicking off the section of today's talks about the oceans and our coastlines. My project is titled Climate Change and Coastal Ecosystems, a case study on sea level rise in San Diego. So first, a bit of background on the motivation behind this project and where it fits into the overall research picture. So these coastal ecosystems you see here are extremely valuable for a number of reasons. They provide food and income for billions of people around the planet. They support massive tourism and fishing industries. They protect coastlines from flooding and erosion. They also sequester significant amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. And the research on climate impacts on these ecosystems is a very broad area of ongoing science, which is extremely important for informing both current and future restoration and management decisions. Now for our project, we focused specifically on an area that hasn't been studied very much so far in the literature, and that is the effects of sea level rise on nearshore rocky habitats like the ones that we have here in San Diego. The nearshore rocky habitats are some of the most productive on the planet. They're very valuable both ecologically and economically, and they are based around several primary producing species of both kelp and seagrass, which is what I'll be focusing on today. So that brings me to the overall research questions for our project. First, how will sea level rise affect the size and location of these rocky nearshore habitats? And secondly, can the data set that I'll be using to answer that first question be used to map these areas at on larger scales and at high accuracies? So the primary data set of interest that I'll be talking about was collected by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as part of a coastal mapping program called SHOALS. This is an airborne LiDAR survey, which is what you see here in the figure on the right. And it is topobathymetric, which is a fancy way of saying that it records the elevation of the coastline at the same time as it's taking bathymetry or depth measurements of the ocean. And this data set has been collected around essentially the entire coastline of the United States, so it could be potentially very valuable for mapping these valuable habitats at large scales. I'll talk more about shoals in a moment, but first, a description of the model that we use to represent the nearshore rocky habitat. So we focused on two primary producers in particular, giant kelp and surfgrass. Both of these are what is called ecosystem engineers, which means that their presence creates habitat for other organisms to live. They both also live on rocky substrate, so many species of seagrass live in sand or mud, but surfgrass is somewhat unique in that it's able to take root on rock. Now both of these also need certain levels of light in order to photosynthesize and to grow. So they're constrained primarily by the presence of rocky substrate at the right levels of depth and light, which will change as sea levels rise. Now we also isolated the intertidal zone as an area of interest because it is on the front lines of sea level rise, so to speak, and it hosts its own unique ecology that plays a vital role in supporting surrounding ecosystems. So this plot here shows the intuition behind our project. This is a cross-shore profile from our first study site up in Encinitas. And each of the areas of interest I just described are shown in the different colors here. So Kelp is generally found deeper than 5 meters of water. That's shown here by the orange points. Surfgrass is usually shallower than 5 meters. It's shown by the green points. And the intertidal zone is from 1 meter above to 1 meter below sea level, and that's shown here in red. Now, as you can see, as sea levels continue to rise, both the size and the relative location of these areas will change. And what we are hoping to quantify specifically is how the amount of rocky substrate within each area will change, because that is what kelp and surfgrass need in order to grow. So we did that using the SHOALS data that I introduced earlier. So this is what it looks like. This is up at our first study site in Encinitas. What you see here on the color bar is a measurement of roughness. So higher values, closer to the red, indicate that the seafloor is more complex, and that usually corresponds to rocky substrate. And smoother or lower values here in the blue area mean that the seafloor is smooth, and we can assume that the substrate there is sandy. So to give you an idea of how this data set works, how it is collected, this is a video taken in Los Angeles a couple months ago of a SHOALS plane doing a coastal survey. So you can see the swath of green lasers that it's using to monitor the coastline. These surveys emit 150,000 pulses per second and can map up to 16 square kilometers an hour. And again, have been done across the entire coastline of the United States. It's a little hard to see there. But the next one. So the next step, there we go. The next step for us was to translate those SHOALS roughness values into substrate classifications so we could quantify the amount of rocky substrate in this area. So we did that by comparing our SHOALS data set to a data set collected by the San Diego Association of Governments, or SANDAG, which is what you see here on the right. Now this SANDAG data was collected using multi-beam echo sounding, verified by on-site scuba diving and photography. So it's known to be very accurate, and we were treating it as ground truth for this location. So we just related these data sets using a very simple algorithm. We defined a roughness threshold, and points above that threshold were considered rocky, points below it were considered sandy. And then we could verify our choices by using the SANDAG data set, and then quantify the amount of rocky substrate in each of our interest zones. So that's what you see here. This plot shows depth along the x-axis and percentage of rocky coverage on the y-axis. The SANDAG ground truth data is shown here in blue, and the SHOALS LiDAR data is shown in red. And you can see the algorithm we defined has the two data sets tracking reasonably well. The numbers you see here along the top show both the percent coverage in each of our zones as well as the total rocky area. And the intertidal zone here is shown in red, the surfgrass zone is shown in green, and the kelp zone is shown in orange. And this shows the distribution of rocky substrate at present day sea levels. And as we apply different sea level rise scenarios, we can see how that will change. So the first thing you'll notice is that the intertidal zone loses essentially all of its rocky coverage within the first meter of sea level rise as it's pushed onto what is now sandy beach. The surfgrass zone also loses the deeper edge of this rocky reef here as that portion of the reef will become too deep for surfgrass to photosynthesize. And the kelp zone gains a little bit of coverage as it takes over some of that area from the surfgrass. So this plot shows that same data in static form. So we have sea level rise on the x-axis and percent rocky coverage on the y-axis. The SANDAG ground truth data is shown by the solid line, and the SHOALS LiDAR data is shown by the dashed line. So you can see the overall trends. There's, again, a slight increase in the kelp zone, a decrease from around an average of 55% in the surfgrass zone to 25% by the time we get to 2 meters of sea level rise. And the intertidal zone loses essentially all of its coverage within the first meter. So next, we wanted to see if we could reproduce these results at another study site using only the SHOALS data. So we chose La Jolla Cove for a number of reasons. There's a fairly sizable surfgrass bed in La Jolla Cove shown here. So this contour line is showing the 5 meter contour, and all of that rocky area there is occupied by a large surfgrass bed. There are also very steep rocky cliffs along the backside of the cove. So as sea levels rise, these zones will be compressed against those steep cliffs. They won't be able to migrate shoreward onto the beach. And again, the color bar here, the values closer to red correspond to rock, the values closer to blue correspond to sand. So we were able to use the same algorithm that we defined in Encinitas to classify substrate as rocky or sandy, find the percent coverage in each of our zones of interest, and see how they will change under different sea level rise scenarios. So the trends here are fairly similar. You have loss of rocky coverage in the intertidal zone and the surfgrass zone, while the kelp zone increases slightly. You will notice that the difference, or the loss in the intertidal and surfgrass zone is not quite as dramatic as it was in Encinitas, which I will explain in a moment. But first, we were also interested in the change in the relative location of these zones. So this plot here is showing the current day surfgrass zone in blue, and each subsequent sea level rise scenario is shown in green. So as sea levels rise, they'll be compressed, or the zone will be compressed against those steep cliffs, and the total area will be reduced. We also found that for every meter of sea level rise, there's about a 50-meter shoreward shift in these zones. So if we reach 2 meters of sea level rise, this zone will have shifted shoreward by 100 meters. This plot here shows the same idea for the intertidal zone, and you can see that the effects are even more striking within just 1 meter of sea level rise. The intertidal zone essentially disappears. This is an area of active research. There are researchers here at Scripps researching this now. It's a phenomenon known as coastal squeeze, and they're trying to determine what will happen to the ecology of the intertidal zone as it is squished against the coastline, specifically against steep cliffs like this. So next, we wanted to see how our results compared between the two study sites. So that's what you see here. La Jolla is shown by the solid line, and Encinitas is shown by the dashed line. You see the overall trends are very similar. There's an increase in the kelp zone, a decrease in both the surfgrass and the intertidal zones. You'll notice also that the decrease is not quite as steep at La Jolla. That's because at Encinitas, these zones are able to shift shoreward onto sandy beach, so they lose a larger percentage of their rocky coverage as it becomes sand, while in La Jolla, these areas are compressed against the cliffs, but that nearshore area is still fairly rocky. So the increase in overall, or in the percentage of rocky coverage is not quite as steep. But overall, the trends are very similar, so we were able to reproduce our results between the two study sites. Now, circling back to original research questions. The first one, how will sea level rise affect the distribution of these rocky nearshore habitats? We found that the shallow areas will be most acutely affected, surfgrass and intertidal habitats in particular, as they are moved onto sandy beach or compressed against these cliffs, will change both in size and location, and that will have significant ecological impacts on these areas. And we also found that these nearshore habitats migrate shoreward by 50 meters per every meter of sea level rise. And for our second question about the SHOALS data set and its potential to be used to map these nearshore habitats at larger scales, the answer is it looks promising. We were able to use a very simple algorithm to relate the SHOALS LiDAR data to an existing data set and found very similar results between the two. And this could be potentially a very useful tool for coastal mapping and monitoring, and a possible area for future research. So why does all this matter? Climate change poses an existential threat to these coastal habitats, and if we continue to lose them at the rate that we are, we'll see wide-scale collapse around the world. Billions of people's livelihoods and sources of food will be affected, especially vulnerable communities in developing nations. It's also important to note that sea level rise is only one piece of the puzzle here, so we need to consider all the impacts of climate change on these coastal ecosystems. In our analysis, for example, kelp showed a small increase in area, but in reality, the other climate stressors have already impacted kelp significantly, especially increases in water temperature, higher wave stress, and potentially future changes in sedimentation patterns. So we need to look at the whole picture of climate impacts on these ecosystems so that we can understand how they will react in the future. So what's next and what can we do? First and foremost is decarbonization and lowering our emissions. But even if we stopped emitting carbon dioxide tomorrow, we would still be locked in for a significant amount of sea level rise and atmospheric warming. So adaptation is crucial. Groups like the California State Government's Ocean Protection Council have developed very extensive and detailed adaptation programs for our coastlines, both specifically for sea level rise and for climate resilience in general. They've also are in the process of developing a statewide inventory of our coastal habitats and are potentially considering expanding the network of marine protected areas to increase climate resilience. So tools like SHOALS, that data set, and the work that we've done here can be useful for informing these sorts of management and restoration decisions. But overall, we need to move these projects out of the planning and proposal stages and into actual implementation at scale to preserve these ecosystems for generations to come. And I'd just like to quickly thank everyone who was involved in this project, Mark Merrifield and Corey Gabriel for allowing me to be here and making this all possible, Bill O'Reilly for his MATLAB brilliance and patience and generosity with his time, Ed Parnell and Matt Costa for their advice on the biology side of things, Michelle Okahiro, Julia Fielder, and all of the Coastal Process Group, my parents, and all of you guys. It's been an absolute joy sharing this experience with you guys. So I'm just extremely grateful for all of this, and would love to take questions at this time. Yes.
So getting to like 2 meters of sea level rise would require something of the order of a century. During that century, however, the coast is going to recede due to coast erosion, so the bluffs are going to probably recede also several meters. Have you taken that into account?
Yeah, for purposes of this analysis, we didn't look at sort of shoreline receding, but obviously, yeah, by the time we get to 2 meters of sea level rise, the entire coastline will be transformed. So the specific maps and I mean, this is like a 1 by 1 meter resolution quantification of the rocky substrate. So that all of that will change over that century if we do reach 2 meters of sea level rise. So yeah, there's definitely some more intricacies there of how the coastline will change over that time. It's not an instantaneous process, and there'll be a lot of change besides just what we see here with sea level rise. So yeah, that's definitely a good point.
Your topography stays constant.
Yeah. For purposes of this, we kept the topography constant, but in reality, we will see drastic changes all along the coastline. Yeah. Yeah.
So you were saying that even if we stopped emitting carbon dioxide tomorrow, that we're going to have sea level rise.
Right.
And then you mentioned, so that means we need to adjust. What would some of that adjustment look like related to the loss of the seagrass and the increase of the kelp?
Yeah. So there's a lot of work being done on this area, both specifically for sea level rise in terms of our actual coastal infrastructure, but for these ecosystems, this is an area of active research because it seems like, and this is a very hard question to answer, right? Because the stressors are so extreme and the scope of the climate problem is so large that, I mean, you could look at it and be forgiven for saying that it's a lost cause, but there's some optimism in ideas around expanding these marine protected areas and really investing in sort of scaled restoration to preserve these ecosystems, because if we do nothing, they're going to suffer, and we're going to lose a lot of the coverage and all the ecosystem benefits that they bring. So really it starts with sort of experimentational projects, because we haven't really done these projects at scale yet and really invested in restoration and conservation. So to find those answers, we have to try first, you know. So yeah, it'll be interesting as these projects are moving from sort of proposals and planning stages into potentially being implemented at scale, what the results are like if we're able to conserve and expand these areas. But yeah, so we'll know that in the future.